Upholstery may not seem like real woodworking, but learning how to do a simple footstool or a basic chair seat is really not that difficult. Knowing how to do it properly will enhance those projects that you make, and not to mention add comfort to the end user. There are a number of options for making an upholstered slip seat. Some are much better than others. One simple means is to just use a piece of plywood as the seat with a couple of holes drilled in to allow the air to escape as you sit down. That's acceptable, but to me it leaves a pretty hard surface to sit on. Another method would be to use plywood as the framing for the seat and use webbing in a somewhat of a traditional manner. To me, that wastes a lot of plywood, so I'm going to be sticking with the traditional method, using 1x3s for the framing of the seat, webbing, and then several layers of different types of padding, followed by a muslin cover, and then my leathered upholstered seat. It's important that the seat frame fit properly into your chair rails because it's part of the chair structure. If the seat doesn't fit right, you might have some squeaking, the joinery might be a little bit more under stress, and that's not good for the chair overall. The frame needs to fit really snugly into the rails to start with. That'll take out any of the guesswork out of the equation of building the frame. And the allowances for the upholstery then would be made later in the process after everything's fit squarely into your rails. The exception would be the inside corner of the front and back legs. If you have those inside of the rails, you're going to need to cut that away at this time and then cut uniformly around the frame once that's all built. The amount of gap you're going to want to leave depends on the thickness of your upholstery material. Our leather is 1/16 of an inch thick. The inside corner material, where the leg is, the leather will be folded over for 3 full thicknesses, so we need to make an allowance of at least 3/16 of an inch, at least on those inside corners where everything will be folded over. The rest of the chair around the sides, we're going to leave 1/16 of an inch for the leather and an additional 32nd of an inch for the fabric, and a little bit of breathing room or wiggle room to be able to fit that seat in without actually stressing the leather for being a little bit off. So 3/32 of an inch on each side. All of the angles in the seat frame are referenced by taking the angle from the front seat rail to the side seat rail. I used a block against one side to let the blade of my bevel gauge stand away from the side rail. By using the bevel gauge in a T format rather than an L, that allows me to get both the obtuse and the acute angle at the same time. I can simply flip over my bevel gauge to get any of the angles in the seat. And because the front and the back are parallel to one another, that means left and right should both be opposite angles. We have recorded the angle from our bevel gauge as 10 degrees for reference using our Woodpecker's bevel angle finder. That allows us to reset the gauges in case anything gets bumped out of alignment. So I'm going to take the angle that I locked in on my bevel gauge, and I've already set this at the 10 degrees, angling off the table at 10 degrees, and that's locked in. But just to double check it, I'll bring my bevel gauge up to the rail that keeps that I butt the wood against, and double check that the fence or my track is square and in line with this angle that I've set. And that looks good, right at 10. The front and the back of the frame are cut to match the chair first, matching them to each chair individually for a proper fit. You're going to want to start with boards that are actually longer than what you need for your chair, because that way you can just cut it down to size and you won't have any issues there. To start with, we're going to want to make the cutouts for the back legs and the front legs. The inside corners of those legs should have a little curve to it so that the fabric has a little bit of an ease as it goes around the chair legs. Our chair legs have that rounded off edge anyway. So it'll be a nicer fit having that radiused corner. To do that radius, I used a 3/16 of an inch drill bit and just drilled down in to make the radius of the corner, and then cut in with the bandsaw to make the allowances for the legs. After the corners have been cut for the back legs, you can set that into place on the rails. Mark on the rails the length of the long part, and then transfer your angle using your bevel gauge to those marks. Then you'll cut off the ends of the back seat frame, and that'll fit in really well. The side pieces are going to be a lot easier to do. With those, we have our angle on the sliding bevel gauge. With the front and the back parts into place, you can simply set your pieces on top and mark from underneath the chair what the angle is on those pieces, and then cut them off to length. You could also measure the distance between those. You do want a snug fit from front to back, like I said before, so everything should fit all the way around into the rabbets on the rails. Now that you have all your parts fitting snugly into your seat rails, you want to mark the face side, which is the downward side, on each piece. That way, once you have everything upholstered, you can still figure out which chair each part goes into. You also want to mark the parts, which one is front and which is back. Especially on the side parts, you need to know which is right, left, front, and back, because those parts could actually be flipped over and still fit in okay. Because you can see the line, and if I turn this piece around, it fits in there, but my lines don't match up. I'll have a piece that looks like this if I were to glue it in incorrectly. We're going to mark the location for the dominoes. The dominoes are set in at about 1.5 inches from the outside edge of the frame. That ensures that they won't blow through the sides when you plunge the domino. The marking line would be perpendicular to the front and the back of the chair. So that means it's going to approach the angled side pieces at an angle instead of square with the sides. Okay, so now that I've got my domino positions marked, I have the domino set up to the lowest setting, which means I'm going to have to hang the pieces off the edge of the table a little bit so that it comes down all the way and I don't have to use a riser or something to account for the difference. It's at the lowest setting, and that'll put this as where the center of the domino is. That'll come more than halfway down on my 3/4 inch board, as you can see. And that's good. I want it towards the bottom, which is part of the reason why I need to make sure that I have my parts marked for front or for back. So I like these Veritas dogs pretty well because they have a flat side to them. And I'm lining it up with the line that I drew. You can see the point here in the triangle that I've got it lined up with the center of the triangle point, as well as right underneath this clear guide. If I'm off, you can see that I'm not on the line. So I want that lined up correctly. And I've got the domino set on narrow. This is my setting for the 25mm depth. I want to keep it tight against the work, flat and level, so that it ends up straight. The dominoes we've chosen to use are 50mm long by 8mm thick. That's about 1/3 of the thickness of our frame. I need this hanging off the end of the table again so that I can plunge into it correctly. The Veritas flat edges like this allow me to line up and lock in a position pretty well by just angling it. Don't have to be square to the table as I'm doing this. That gives me plenty of room to run the domino. The domino does have these little pins on the bottom that I can pop out and use whichever one to line up against the edge of my board. Like if I wanted to center it there every time I could do that. If I wanted it there every time I could do it. That would be reliable for this piece, but not quite as accurate on an obtuse angle like this. The pin registers on the side rather than on the corner. In this case, it's better to just go with a straight line and match that up with the domino. And we're using dominoes. We're starting on the back side. One of the advantages of using the front and back is that we have square ends that we can be pulling it together. If we had put the angle as the side piece is going all the way to the front, then we'd be clamping on angles, and that's not as fun. The frame is sized for a snug fit right now, so we need to fit the frame with the gap around the outside edge for the upholstery. As I mentioned earlier, our allowance for the upholstery is 3/32 of an inch per side. We'll trim this off on our fest table. We already have the angle set in, and trim all 4 sides equally. And this will also allow me to take off any unevenness, like this edge has a slightly longer edge here. A bevel is needed around the top edge of the slip seat frame. So with the slip seat in the chair, measure the distance down from the top edge to the top of the rail at a 1/16 of an inch, because the frame will be lifted up a 1/16 of an inch for our leather as it wraps underneath. And we want to make sure that that edge isn't below the edge of the rail. We also don't want it too much above the edge of the rail, because that would leave a hard, uncomfortable edge. We mark the sides of the frame with a pencil line and then measure in about 1 inch from each of the edges for the top edge of that bevel. Then we take it over to our workbench, clamp it into place on the workbench, and bevel the edges with a hand plane. Because we don't want sharp edges left that might damage our leather, we're also going to ease the edges a little bit on anywhere that the leather would be folding over the frame. In our next video, we'll make a few simple tools to aid in doing a professional looking job of the upholstery.